UNL. I would like to welcome you all to the SNR Seminar Series. The Fall Seminar Series is a weekly seminar showcasing research and topics from UNL as well as speakers from around the world. As you have probably noticed, seminars will be entirely virtual this year through Zoom. Seminars will be Wednesdays from 3:30 to 4:30. Some of the previous seminars have been recorded and are available on the SNR Seminar webpage. The next seminar, occurring on next Wednesday, October 21st, will be Dr. Dara Wald. She will be presenting on assessing the role of trust and values in social conflict over invasive species management, a case study on Guam. To minimize disruptions by Zoom, the chat will only be directed to the hosts. So after the talk or during, if one pops up, type your questions into the chat to me and I will pass your questions on. Also, please turn off your video to minimize any bandwidth issues. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cecil Jennings, who is a fisheries research biologist for the U.S. Geological Survey. His work addresses an assortment of fish management and conservation issues and includes investigations into fish population dynamics, life history, age and growth, food habits, habitat use and movement patterns, assemblage responses to habitat disturbances, and human dimensions. He studied biology, natural science, and conservation during his time as an undergraduate at Carthage College in Wisconsin. He obtained his master's degree in fisheries and wildlife ecology from Mississippi State University, and he obtained his PhD in fisheries science from the University of Florida. He also was recently elected as the next second vice president of the American Fisheries Society. Without any further ado, presenting on assessing the supply and demand for trout in North Georgia under current and projected thermal regimes, here's Dr. Cecil Jennings.
Okay. So thank you for that warm introduction. As soon as I can figure out how to work this thing here. All right, so we good? Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
All right, so so this project is an interdisciplinary project I did with some folks down in, well, they're all here in the school, but some are GIS folks and some are human dimensions folks. So the first thing I have to do is give a shout out to Jenna Hag. Jenna was the master student on this project, and she did all the boots on the ground stuff. Nate Niblink and I were her co-major advisors. Bynum Bowley and Brian Irwin were her other committee members, and the four of us were co-PIs on this project that was funded by Georgia Department of Natural Resources. All right, so we've all heard about climate change and specifically global warming, and there's been a lot of debate. Well, there really isn't any debate. Some folks say there's a debate, but clearly the planet is getting warmer. The recent measurements, so measurements going back a long time, show that air temperature has gone up. That's supposed to be a 0.6 degrees since the 1900s, and water temperature has gone up 1/10 of a degree, 0.1 degrees C over the same time period. And air temperature is forecast to increase 3 to 5 degrees C over the next 100 years. So clearly, there's been a long trend of warming, and that trend is projected to continue in the future. This warming climate and warming waters is projected to negatively affect cool water species such as salmonids. And by cool water, we mean temperatures 24 degrees C or less. A lot of people don't know that Georgia lies at the southernmost fringes of salmonid range in the US. And there are 3 species of trout that exist in the state: rainbow trout, brook trout, and brown trout, but their ranges are confined to the northern third of the state, so up in the mountains. There are a lot of factors that limit the distribution of all 3 species in the state. Brook trout is the only of the species that is native to the state. Its original distribution is unknown, but it's now limited to high elevation streams, primarily headwater streams that are above waterfalls and other man-made obstructions that limit the upstream migration of the other two species. And that's primarily because brook trout is at a competitive disadvantage with rainbow trout and brown trout. Rainbow trout and brown trout have been stocked in Georgia for a very long time, and they're actually now considered to be naturalized. They're widely distributed in what's called the trout waters in the lower elevation streams, although rainbows are a little more widely distributed than the browns are. Up in those northern counties, about 38 of them, there's about 4,000 miles of trout waters, and that is waters with suitable thermal regimes. These trout waters support a popular trout fishery. As of last count, there's about 160,000 trout anglers. And the way it works in Georgia, you have to have a fishing license. A basic fishing license is about 15 bucks. And then on top of that fishing license, you have to buy a trout stamp specifically to fish for trout. And that trout stamp, the funds from that go to support the husbandry and stocking of trout for the fishery. There are only limited reproduction. So natural reproduction is limited to about 2,400 miles of the 4,000 miles. And so because of that, Georgia DNR and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they have to stock trout to maintain the fishery in those other 1,600 miles that can't support naturally reproducing populations. So the stocking between Georgia DNR and the Fish and Wildlife Service is about 1.2 million fingerling a year of all three of these species. Trout fishing is a large economic driver in the state. As of 2014, which is the last year that I could get estimates for, that fishery was worth about $170 million to the economy of Georgia. And so as you might imagine, DNR is keen to have that fishery continue, but they are faced with some challenges in maintaining that fishery. The first is that they have a really complicated set of regulations. And so trout management in Georgia from time immemorial has been sort of on an ad hoc basis, and there would be location-specific regulations, stream-specific regulations, and there wasn't any sort of centralized or organized regulation. It wasn't until 2000 that they actually sat down and sort of put something resembling a cohesive set of regulations together. And that plan at this point is now 20 years old, or at the time we started the study, about 17 years old. So these regulations have generalized trout waters where anybody can go fish with, some corn or a hot dog on a hook. And then there's specialized trout waters that have these really restrictive or unique set of harvest regulations. And so there are streams that are delayed harvest only. There are streams that are artificial lures only. There's a certain set of streams that are set aside for young children and senior citizens. And then there are trophy streams where you can only harvest trophy fish. And the really crazy part is sometimes these streams are in very close physical proximity to each other. So, being aware of what stream you're on and what regulations are in effect in that stream was confusing to a lot of anglers, and there was some displeasure with DNR without sort of a uniform set of regulations for the trout. So DNR was actually struggling a little bit to keep all the anglers happy. In addition to all of those sort of crazy rules, we just talked about the climate models predicting 3 to 5% degree C warming in the future, and that warming may affect the persistence of trout. We just talked about the big economic driver that trout is for Georgia's economy, and so they certainly don't want to lose that revenue stream. So in addition to the environmental challenges, Georgia is a rapidly growing state. It's seeing very dramatic increases in population size, along with very rapid changes in the ethnic makeup of the people that are moving to Georgia. And with the population increase and demographic changes, what used to be the typical angler is no longer the typical angler. And so Georgia is trying to figure out how do they satisfy an animal that doesn't exist, which is a typical angler. All right, so there are a lot of anglers, and Georgia DNR doesn't know what these various constituent groups want from their trout fishing opportunities. So that uncertainty was the impetus for this project. And so this is the larger project that Brian Irwin, myself, Bynum Boley, and Nate Niblink, that we undertook, and there was a two-part study. So the first part was a human dimensions facet where we interviewed anglers, trout anglers, and so to be included in the survey, they had to have purchased a trout stamp. And we wanted to know what their satisfaction was with trout management in the state. And this was like a 30-page questionnaire that dealt with everything from what county you're from, what counties you fish in, how far you travel to fish, how much you spend to fish. Are you satisfied with what you're catching? If you change the regulations, how would you change them? What are you satisfied with? What are you dissatisfied with? It's sort of a wide-ranging survey, and it was done on a Likert scale, a 5-point scale from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. The second part of the study was a mapping of trout supply with angler demand, and that is the part of the study that I'm going to be presenting to you today. And so we wanted to map current supply, and supply is where DNR and the Fish and Wildlife is stocking, and then demand is where people are fishing as identified by the results of the survey. We want to do that for currently, and then we also want to do it in the future. And the future is 30 years out to 2050, and we want to do that for 3 warming scenarios. And I'll get to what those are in a minute. Well, actually, I could get to them here. And so you're going to see this graph here on the right of Fairmount. The gray, this is a stream network here. So orient you to this graph. The squiggly lines are stream networks. The gray is unsuitable habitat. That means the water temperature is 24 degrees or higher. The blue squiggly lines are the current habitat. That's the current suitable thermal habitat. And then we have the red, blue, and green lines are the 3 warming scenarios, and I'll describe what those are in a minute. So the objectives for the project were to, identify when and where temperature poses the greatest challenge to trout habitat availability. And by availability, we mean persistence and trout fishing opportunities. And we want to intersect that information with current and future thermal habitat with angler preference data to look at potential for maintaining fishery and angler satisfaction. So we talked about 38 counties up in northern Georgia that have trout. We collected water samples from 156 gauging stations. Roughly half were USGS stations, and the other half were Georgia DNR stations. These gauging stations were put out in streams from first order headwater streams up in the mountains, all the way to 8th order streams down around the Atlanta metro area, here sort of in the bottom center of this map. And this area encompassed 9 watersheds, the watershed of 9 different rivers. And as watershed boundaries don't stay within the state boundary, we actually included the watershed boundaries, even if they went out of state, such as up in Tennessee, over here in Alabama and North Carolina, up in this corner up here. And so that's the actual study area and watershed boundaries that we used in the study. So we had a whole bunch of predictive variables, and don't expect you to read all of these. I'm just telling you that we had like 9 predictive variables that were feeding data into this, and we did some modeling. So our response variable was stream temperature data. And the predictive variables were all of those other variables that I just showed you on the previous site. And we were looking at mean daily maximum temperatures in the streams from May to September. And we used data from 1999 to 2017 from those 156 sites in the study area. Of the 9 covariates that we started out with, we used Pearson's correlation analysis to look for autocorrelation among the variables, and we got rid of 5 of them, and we were left with just, we got rid of 4 of them, and we're left with these 5 as the covariates that were included in the actual modeling that we did. All right, so these are our climate warning scenarios. So these RCPs are reactive concentration pathways for carbon dioxide. So these are models that predict carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere based on some various modeling. I forgot to tell you, the air temperature data that we used was from a PRISM website from the period 1980 to 2010. Our forest cover data was from the land cover database. Our elevation data came from a regression estimate independent slope model minus digital elevation models. And then the watershed area and impervious cover data were also from the land cover database. All right, so back to these warming scenarios. So there are 4 warming scenarios here based on amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is linked to a certain warming projection. So the most conservative of these is RCP2, representative concentrated pathway, and that represents about a 1 degree warming over the next. So this vertical red line is the year 2050, so that's 30 years out from now. And that was our endpoint for the modeling. And so a 1 degree warming out to 2050. This is the intermediate scenario, 4.5, RCP 4.5 was the intermediate scenario, and that's a 2 degree warming. RCP 6.0, we did not include in the analysis because at the 50-year point, it's exactly the same as the 4.5. And then the extreme scenario is the RCP 8.5, which represents an almost 3 degree warming in temperature between now and 2050. So those are the 3 scenarios that we modeled going forward. We used mixed effects models with year as a fixed effect and site as the random effect. We modeled temperature response from May to September with those 5 predictive variables that I showed you earlier. And then we also, these are where we got the future data from. So Global Climate Change Model 3 is a mid-range model that predicted local temperatures from about 1979 to about 2005 in the Southeast really well, without much bias either way. So those data are the climate, that model is what we use for the climate projection model. And I just talked about the representative concentration pathways that we used. And so that's these 3 scenarios here. So we had air temperature and elevation. when we looked at this map, one of the things that we looked at were polygons upstream of the gauging station. So the black dot represents the gauging station, and the polygon represent 1,000 meters upstream of the gauging station to look at the effects of shading upstream, since we know that can affect stream temperature. And also we looked at a 50-meter wide buffer on either side of the stream, again, to look at how that affected temperature. And so we threw that in the model as well as impervious cover. Well, when we ran these models, I neglected to mention that after we had these set of candidates, we created a set of about 9 candidate models, and we evaluated them in an AIC framework for model selection. And once we got done with those models, air temperature was the only one of the predictive variables that was always present in the top model. The other ones did not show up as contributing significantly to the prediction of stream water temperature. So we took our air temperature model, we looked and coupled it with the future stream temperature model. All right, so air temperature, stream temperature. We then applied species thresholds. So we have some idea of what the thermal tolerances are for these various species. And so brook trout, they can't tolerate warm waters warmer than 22 degrees for 2 days straight. After that, they start dying. And rainbow trout and brook trout is 23 degrees C for 2 consecutive days. And so we apply those thermal thresholds to the forecasted stream data. Whoops, back up here too fast. And then we applied our warming climate scenarios to look at what the temperature is going to be. And so the species thresholds and the future climate would then allow us to map future thermal habitat. So how will habitat change under these various climate scenarios? All right, so what are our results? Well, water temperature, we had a total of about 3,400 data points from the 138 gauging stations for the 4 months. The lowest temperatures were generally in the spring in May, about 19 degrees C, and it ranged all the way up to about 37.7 or 34 degrees in the month of July. But we actually focused our analysis on August because that was the period, August wasn't appreciably cooler than July, and that's the period when the fish would have been exposed to warm water for the longest period. And so we figured if there was a bottleneck, it would be in August. And so all our modeling is for August data. All right, so what does future thermal habitat look like? So this is for brook trout. And again, reorient you to this figure. The black polygon is the watershed, the study area. The gray squiggly lines are the streams. The gray lines are unsuitable habitats. And the blue line is the current habitat availability. And the green, blue, and red are going to be habitat availability under the various warming scenarios. So the current baseline for brook trout is about 5,100 kilometers of stream with suitable temperatures. But under the conservative warming scenario of 1 degree change, 1 degree increase in temperature, brook trout will lose about 25% of the available habitat, what they have currently. And that's indicated here by the green. You can still sort of see, where they lost a little at the fringes. And most of this green area is sort of the higher elevation streams. And so you're seeing temperature remain, or a suitable temperature remain in the high elevation streams. Under the intermediate warming scenario, the brook trout lose about half of their suitable thermal habitat. And under the extreme warming scenario, they lose about 2/3 of their suitable climate habitat, suitable thermal habitat. Now we're going to look at the same thing for rainbow trout and brown trout, since they had similar tolerances. So their baseline is about twice that of brook trout, but under the same warming scenarios, they lose about the same percentage. So under the conservative scenario, brown and rainbow trout lose about 1/4 of their available habitat. Under the intermediate, they lose about half. And under the extreme, they lose about 2/3, or just at 70% of their available habitat. And again, their habitats are being pushed up to the higher elevation streams because of the warming that's predicted to occur. All right, so now that we have what future habitat's going to be, we're going to circle back and couple those data with the demand data that we derived from Haley Yando's thesis. And Haley Yando was the graduate student that conducted the human dimensions survey about angler satisfaction. And so we sent out about 4,000 surveys to licensed trout anglers. We got back about 624. We ended up eliminating some of them. We could go into why we did that later, but we ended up with 464 respondents that we used to couple our future habitat data with. Each respondent was assigned a dominant ID as to what county they did most of their fishing in, and then what species of trout they preferred to fish for. We didn't get, because many people fished in many counties, we had established a 10% minimum threshold in a county, and we didn't get that. And so most counties had less than a 10% response rate of anglers in their county. So we ended up having to group counties to get the response rate up to 10%. And so that's sort of what that looked like. And so remember early on, we had this map that shows you these 38 counties, and now we have much fewer than that in these groups to get the threshold up to 10%. And so the new groups are now West Georgia, the Metro Atlanta area. This is Gillum, Lee, and Dawson counties, Fannin County, Union and Towns, Rayburn, White County, and Havisham, Stevens, and Hart County are these groupings, right? So the responses that you're going to see are for these groups. All right, so I'm going to orient you to this map. So this map here is for a rainbow trout. Rainbow trout was the species that was preferred in all of the groupings. And so they didn't have a particular preference, but of the preference that they did have, rainbow trout was the highest in all of them. So these data are going to be for rainbow trout. So in West Georgia, there was about a 42% preference for rainbow trout, but West Georgia was forecast to lose about 89% of the available habitat for rainbow trout in that area, and that's the section that had the largest amount of habitat loss for trout. The mountain counties, Havisham, up here in the Fannin County, up in the mountains, they only had about a 16% loss up in Havisham, and I can't even read the labels up in these two. They're being blocked by this Zoom banner. But the lower elevation streams were the ones that were losing most of the habitat. The higher elevation ones were keeping most of their habitat. Interestingly, Metro Atlanta lost 100% of the habitat, but Metro Atlanta is a special case that we're going to come back to in a little bit down in the presentation. So this is habitat loss with the conservative climate scenario. rainbow trout, and the extreme climate loss scenario. And so West Georgia would lose 93% of its habitat under the extreme. So in all of these scenarios, West Georgia just basically lost all the habitat, even though those people in West Georgia had a pretty high preference of going after rainbow trout. So you see right away there's a conflict where people want to fish for trout the most. Rainbow trout is the area where rainbow trout fishing opportunities are going to be diminished the most. All right, so to sort of give you a different perspective on how anglers perceive DNR's stocking regimen and their status, supply and demand ratio, basically. So here we have, let me see if I can move this thing. Up in Rabun County, there's a bit of a preference for brook trout, but they're not stocked at all. And so DNR is not stocking brook trout in some place where people, not a lot, but there are a few that are wanting to fish for brook trout. Brown trout, they're stocking a little more than people are fishing for. And then for rainbow trout, you're actually stocking more than fishing. So they're sort of overperforming a little bit for rainbow trout. For Union and Towns County, they're actually right on target for stocking and people's preference for. They're stocking a little more brown trout than what people are preferring, and the same for people want more brook trout than what they're stocking. And then you can sort of follow this trend for the other counties. But in some cases they're overperforming a little, in some cases they're underperforming, but for the most part they're pretty close. The notable exception being brook trout in all of these. This is the other four groups, and so again I'm not going to go group by group, but you sort of get the general idea. They're doing pretty well, and they need a little bit of tweaking here and there. The Metro Atlanta area, even though it loses 100% of the habitat based on forecasting, Lake Sidney Lanier is a huge reservoir just northeast of Atlanta. It's fed by the Chattahoochee River, and it's the drinking water supply for the city of Atlanta. And it has cool water releases all year long. And so there's a hyperlimnetic release in the Chattahoochee River west of Atlanta basically all year. So even though without the influence of that hyperlimnetic release, there wouldn't be any trout habitat there. There's actually quite an abundant supply of trout habitat, and Metro Atlanta, on the west side of Atlanta, just inside the 285 Beltway, has a really strong trout fishery because of this cold water release. And so our results don't apply to the Metro Atlanta area because we don't know what the long-term fate of this cool water release, and nothing we predict is going to be relevant because of this cool water release in the Metro Atlanta area. All right, so I'm going to share with you a little bit more of the human dimensions information from Haley Yondo's thesis. And let me orient you to this figure. This is an important satisfaction analysis from the social sciences literature. On this axis over here, we have importance, and it ranges from not important at all the way up to very important on a 5. For 1, so 1 not at all, and 5 is very important. And then on what would be the x-axis, we have satisfaction, with 1 being very dissatisfied and 5 being very satisfied. And so if you, there are a couple of ways you can sort of create quadrants. You can create quadrants by scale centering the data, or you can data center it, have scales based on data. And so that's what we used here. This horizontal line is the sort of 45-degree ISO line where it's equal on top and the bottom. And so if we use a data-centered crosshairs, we create 4 quadrants. The first quadrant in the top right is keep up the good work. So based on people's importance and satisfaction, counties that are falling in that, Georgia DNR is doing a good job with. The top left is concentrate here. It means that it's important to people, but people, they're not satisfied with what's going on there. What's in this third quadrant, bottom left, is low priority. And so people, it's not very important to people. And they're not particularly satisfied or dissatisfied, so that's okay. And then possible overkill is the fourth quadrant, and that's where it's a low priority. They're very satisfied, but it's a low priority area, so they probably could cut back a little bit there because, you know, it's a low priority area. So once we're oriented to, so these letters over here in the actual figure correspond to these groupings over here. So A and G would be Rayburn County and the Metro Atlanta area. Georgia DNR is performing really well. And we already said Metro Atlanta is doing well because of that cold water hypolimnetic release. And Rayburn County is up in the mountains where much of the habitat was being preserved under varying climate scenarios. So naturally, the people up there are pretty happy. H is Western Georgia, and Western Georgia is interesting because it's close to the sort of center of this line. So maybe it's not quite keep up the good work. It's not quite concentrate here. It's sort of a low priority. So it's sort of right in the middle, and that's sort of on the border. Same with Union and Towns counties. F, D, and E would be White, Gilmer, Lumpkin, Dawson, and the Union and Towns County. And those are low priorities counties. And so, you know, they don't have to do a lot of work there because there's not a lot of demand there. And C is Fannin County, and they're possibly overkill there as far as how much they're stocking there. So perhaps they don't need to stock as many fish there, and they can move some of the effort from there up into concentrate here to sort of offset the dissatisfaction with what the fishing is in there. What I didn't tell you is this is for stock trout. This important satisfaction is for stock trout. We have a similar one for catching wild trout. And this is a little interesting because there's not a lot of possible overkill. F, Havisham and Stevens County, but most of them are in the keep up the good work here, and only Western Georgia is in the concentrate here one, which is interesting because H, the Western Georgia, is the group that lost the majority of the habitat. So there's going to be a lot of dissatisfied anglers in Western Georgia when they find out that under these varying climate scenarios, they're going to lose just about all of their trout habitat. All right, so what does all of this mean? Well, we've identified that stream temperatures, summertime stream temperatures are a problem, and we're talking from June to August, and with the biggest problem being in July and August, because those are the hottest months, and August being the period where the fish are exposed to the warmest temperature for the longest. And persistence of wild trout under those conditions would be difficult, especially as the climate warms. This also has some interesting sort of biological implications. Generally, brook trout spawn in the fall, and brown trout and rainbow trout spawn in the spring. But as the temperature warms, brook trout may spawn later and later in the year, and that might put their offspring closer to when brown trout and rainbow trout are in the springtime. And so if brown trout and rainbow trout outcompete brook trout, and all of a sudden there's an overlap in their spawning, whereas before there was a temporal, some temporal dislocation in their spawning. That puts brook trout at greater risk for habitat loss and being outcompeted by these two basically invasive species. And with this warming climate, warming stream temperatures, there's limited ability for brook trout and the other two species to recolonize habitats, even if they're sort of small refugia where they can hang out in a deep hole. They might be limited in their ability to recolonize new areas when the temperature sort of cools up. There's talked about potential habitat loss that in areas that are important to angler, specifically West Georgia, that had a high preference for rainbow trout. It also has the highest degree of habitat loss, and that could result in higher angler dissatisfaction with their ability to catch wild trout. So DNR is facing a potential problem there. But we don't think that things are as bleak as they seem, because despite this really small bottleneck in the summertime, temperatures in the trout stream the rest of the year remain suitable, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The other thing is our scale for this study was sort of coarse. It was 1 to 1,000 meters, and so that's a pretty big area. And some of these streams, you know, they don't have that much distance between them. But the data that we used was on a regional scale, and finding local scale data, watershed level data, was difficult. And so this was the best data we had available. But if you were able to get data on a smaller 1 to 50,000 or 1 to 25,000, that might give you better local resolution, and the situation may be a little better. You might be better able to tailor a stream by stream or watershed by watershed prognosis because of better resolution on a local scale. All right. If we better understood thermal refugia and had a better understanding of angler demand at this sort of finer scale, we might be able to do a few things like modify how DNR is stocking. So currently, DNR stocks their trout in the springtime, generally in April and May, to provide sort of summertime a fishery. Well, as the summertime temperatures become unsuitable, a lot of those fish that are being stocked in April and May don't make it through the summertime. If they're not caught out, they die because of poor water temperatures. And so our recommendation was DNR should modify their stocking to stock about a small percentage, 15, 20% of their fish in April and May, as has been their custom. That would provide some fishery over the summertime, but then wait until temperatures cool down in September and stock the remaining 80% of their fish. And those fish would be available to support the fishery from September all the way through May or June the following year. And those fish remaining would then be coupled with whatever is stocked in May the next year to provide better fishing opportunities throughout the year. And so we view that as DNR getting a better return on their hatchery investment to provide fishing opportunities year round. Also, there may need to be some angler outreach. So they just explain to the anglers in places like West Georgia that, you know, this is a low elevation stream, and as the stream temperatures warm up, we can't chill down all of those streams, and it's just too warm for trout. So, you know, providing you with trout opportunities in this area is beyond our ability, and we encourage you to fish in these other places where trout fishing opportunities persist, even in the middle of the summertime. To our knowledge, our study is sort of a one of a kind because it's the first that we knew of that took social science data for angler preferences and demand and overlaid it with specific habitat forecasting as to where habitat will be available in the future to sort of allow the natural resource agency to better uh, do outreach or change their stocking behavior or whatever. It allows them some fine scale management of their stocking instead of just stocking wholesale across all of their trout streams. And so this to us is sort of a pretty unique thing. And we are advocating that a similar framework might work in other places where there's concern about thermal regime changes and how it affects biota. But the only improvement that we would suggest for ours is to use a finer scale than the 1 to 100,000 that we used in our study. That's the only data that we had available. But perhaps somebody can, if they can use a smaller spatial area and get finer resolution, you can start to provide better resolution data. With that, I want to acknowledge a bunch of folks. These are graduate students and technicians that helped Jenna out in the field deploying and checking these data loggers over those many months. Of course, Nate and Bynum worked for the university, and Brian and I worked for USGS, and the project was funded by Georgia Department of Natural Resources. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and open the floor for questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Really fascinating work. As we wait for people to send questions through the chat, I'll start by asking a question of my own. You mentioned that there are around 160,000 trout anglers in Georgia, and it's a fishery that brings in over $170 million. Yet it's a fishery that's really geographically limited. How does the trout fishing compare to overall fishing as a whole in Georgia?
Well, it's certainly it's a segmented area, and one of the flaws in our design is that so Tennessee has better trout fishing, and you saw that the boundary for the state was right there. So does North Carolina. And so Georgia trout anglers may actually go up into North Carolina, up into Tennessee for trout fishing, but Georgia DNR can't manage trout in those areas. And so, yeah, trout fishing in Georgia, it's a niche market. Georgia is a really large state. It's one of the largest states east of the Mississippi. It has 5 physiographic provinces that go from the ridge and valley up in the mountains all the way to the upper coastal plain, lower coastal plain, down onto the coast. And so there's saltwater fishing, a bunch of large reservoir fishing for striped bass and hybrids, bass, bluegill, crappie, and there are a bunch of rivers in the state that provide river fishing. So I can't tell you a percentage, but it certainly is a small niche fishery compared to other fishing opportunities in the rest of the state.
Awesome. Let's get our first question from Tyler Neely. And he's asking, are there certain types of plants that could be planted alongside certain streams to help reduce the water temperature? Or what other methods might be able to be used to combat rising air and water temperatures?
Well, good question. So one of the things that I didn't say is that some of this land is public land and some of the land is private land. And so Georgia is trying to encourage a 50-meter stream buffer on all of its trout waters, but it's not compulsory. And so certainly there are trees like willows that naturally occur on stream side that aren't there because people plow right, on agricultural lands, people plow right up to the river or the stream. And so certainly having that buffer would help. But that's outside of the control of the agency. A lot of the streams or some portion of the streams occur in national forest. And in those areas that, the stream temperatures do really well. What was the second part of the question again?
Just asking what other methods might also be used to combat the rising water and air temperatures.
Well, certainly reduction in greenhouse gases would help, but that's sort of an uphill battle. I mean, people don't believe COVID is real. How are you going to get them to believe climate change is real? So that's sort of an uphill battle. Planting trees certainly would help with the shading. Better land use practices would help. Another thing I didn't say is that agriculture and sedimentation and pollution all affect habitat quality in the stream, which also contribute to trout persistence. And so those remediation of those things would also help trout persistence in the streams as well.
Awesome. Jess Corman said, great talk. Her question was, what about the indirect effects of temperature on salmonids? For example, shifts in the food resources due to warming streams?
Yes, we did talk. We didn't talk about it, but we mentioned it in the thesis and the report to the state agency. So understand that cool water habitats have a cool water fauna. So just like how trout have certain habitat requirements thermally, their food source in those systems similarly have thermal habitat requirements. And so as trout don't persist, then so too does their food sources. And so if trout can't get the energetic resources they need because their prey has migrated or disappeared or whatever, then there is some bioenergetic costs that aren't going to be met. And so their fitness is potentially compromised. So how big they get, how much fat reserves they lay down, the yolk quality in the eggs, the size of the eggs produced, the motility of the sperm, the viability of the eggs, all of that would be affected by reduced nutrient input if prey is lessened because of increased thermal regimes.
Awesome. The next question is from Larkin Powell. He says, thanks, Cecil. It was interesting that the forest cover was not influential on water temperature. Is that unique for your study? Or do forest buffers along streams keep the forest cover fairly constant and shady?
Well, we had a mosaic of habitats. And remember I talked about the scale? And so the scale was so big that you may have two streams that are very close to each other. One has forest cover and one doesn't. And because we're not able to parse, this is a classical experimental design problem. When within treatment variability is higher than between treatment variabilities, then you don't see significant effects. And I think that's what's going on here.
The next question is from Michael Hayes, and he says, thank you for the very interesting seminar. Do drought conditions ever contribute to elevated stream temperatures due to lower water quantities? Thus, in the future, could a combination of drought and increased temperatures exacerbate stress on trout?
Yes, emphatically yes. And in some of the headwater streams, drought make those streams ephemeral. And so we talk about fish being isolated in little pools. And so that becomes a challenge. If the water quality in the pool that they get stuck in degrades to the point where they can't survive, then you have a fish kill event. And so drought is a real problem on a bunch of levels. Ability to find refugia elsewhere, and also increasing temperatures because of lack of shading and warmer air temperatures.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions I have. Chris, do you have any more?
Nope, I think that's it, except for Mark Peggs, which was partially answered by Cecil already concerning